Blood dripped between her fingers as Petra Carver pressed her hand against the gash across her ribs, stumbling through the narrow alley behind the museum where everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. She'd been warned not to take the conservation job, told that the private collection housed in the subterranean gallery beneath the Metropolitan Museum of Art belonged to people-things that didn't appreciate mortal curiosity. But Petra had spent 6 years earning her master's in art restoration, accumulating debt that threatened to crush her, and when the offer came with a salary that could change her life, she'd signed without reading the fine print. She should have known better. She should have asked why they only wanted her to work between midnight and dawn. She should have questioned the pale-haired woman in the pristine white suit who'd interviewed her, whose eyes had reflected the lamplight like a cat's. She should have run the first night she'd seen the paintings move. Now she was paying for her ignorance in blood, running from something that had erupted from the gallery's deepest vault when she had accidentally triggered a protective ward she hadn't known existed. The creature, all writhing shadows and gnashing teeth, neither fully corporeal nor entirely spectral, had raked claws across her side before she'd managed to slam the vault door between them. But the museum's lower levels were a labyrinth, and she'd gotten lost trying to find the exit, leaving a trail of crimson behind her that anything could follow. The alley opened onto a deserted street in the warehouse district where gentrification hadn't yet reached and the streetlights flickered with unreliable electricity. Petra's vision swam as she leaned against a brick wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wound wasn't deep enough to kill her quickly, but she was losing blood faster than her body could compensate. She needed a hospital. She needed her phone, which she'd dropped 3 floors up when the shadows first attacked. She needed a hand closed around her wrist, and Petra screamed, "Be silent!" The voice was male, commanding, and carried an accent she couldn't immediately place something old world, European perhaps, but filtered through centuries until it belonged to no single country. "You're leading it straight to you with all that noise." She tried to pull away, but the grip was iron strong, and then she was being dragged deeper into the alley, into the darkness that her panic addled. Mind insisted was more dangerous than the open street. Her captor moved with inhuman speed and silence, and when he finally stopped in the shadow of a dumpster and turned to face her, Petra's remaining strength abandoned her entirely. He was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she'd ever seen. White hair fell past his shoulders, luminous even in the darkness, framing a face that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. His skin held the same alabaster pallor, flawless and cold, and his eyes, God, his eyes were the color of fresh blood, burning with an intensity that made her want to look away, even as she found herself unable to. He wore all black, expensive slacks, leather boots, and a shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Everything about him screamed predator, from the way he held himself with casual arrogance to the slight part of his lips that revealed teeth just a bit too sharp. "You've been marked by a revenant," he said, studying her wound with those crimson eyes. "Clumsy of you. What were you doing in Lysandra's gallery?" "I work there," Petra managed, though her tongue felt thick. "Worked there. I'm a conservator. I didn't know, clearly." He released her wrist and tilted his head, listening to something she couldn't hear. "It's coming. The blood scent will drive it mad. Revenants have no reason, only hunger." His gaze returned to her, assessing. "You're going to die if that wound isn't closed." "Hospital," Petra gasped. "I need no time. It's already picked up your trail." He made a sound of annoyance, sharp and decisive, then reached for the hem of his shirt. In one fluid motion, he pulled it over his head, and Petra's words died in her throat. His torso was a map of violence. Scars covered him, white against white, some thin as paper cuts and others thick as rope. They crisscrossed his chest and abdomen in patterns that spoke of battles fought and barely survived claw marks that had torn through flesh, puncture wounds that had pierced vital organs, and burns that had melted skin. Some were old enough to have faded even on immortal flesh, while others looked relatively recent, still holding a faint pink tinge that shouldn't have been possible on someone so pale. The most dramatic was a jagged scar that ran from his left shoulder diagonally across his chest to his right hip, as though something had tried to cleave him in two and had nearly succeeded. Petra stared, forgetting her own pain for a moment. "What happened to you?" "I've lived a very long time, and not all of it peacefully." He was already tearing the expensive shirt into strips with his bare hands, the fabric rending like tissue paper. "This will hurt. Try not to scream again, it attracts attention we don't need." He pressed the wadded fabric against her wound, and Petra bit down on her lip hard enough to taste copper. The pressure sent lightning bolts of agony through her entire side, but she swallowed the scream, reducing it to a whimper. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, wrapping the makeshift bandage around her ribs and tying it tight enough to slow the bleeding. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Alaric." He didn't offer a surname, and something in his tone suggested he didn't need one. "You're Petra Carver. I know because I approved your hiring. Lysandra thought it would be amusing to have a human working in the collection. I'm beginning to regret that approval." Before she could process the implications of his words, a sound echoed through the alley, something between a hiss and a shriek, wrong enough to raise every hair on her body. Alaric's head snapped toward the noise, his entire posture shifting from controlled to predatory in an instant. "Stay behind me," he ordered, moving to put himself between her and the alley's entrance. "And whatever you see, whatever happens, don't run. Running triggers the chase instinct, and I'd rather not have to pursue you while dealing with this." The revenant slithered into view like smoke given weight and malice, its form constantly shifting between solid and shadow. Too many eyes gleamed in what might have been its head, and the wrongness of it made Petra's stomach turn. This was what had attacked her in the vault, what had been hunting her through the museum's depths. Seeing it clearly in the open was somehow worse than fleeing blind. It lunged. Alaric moved faster than Petra's eyes could follow, becoming a white blur that intercepted the revenant mid-strike. The impact sounded like thunder, and then they were fighting. No, not fighting, because fighting implied some level of equality. Alaric was dismantling the creature with ruthless precision, his hands tearing through shadow flesh as though it were nothing. When the revenant tried to wrap tendrils around him, he ripped them free. When it manifested claws, he broke them. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, only brutal efficiency backed by strength that belonged to nightmares. The revenant shrieked again, a sound of rage and pain, and tried to flee. Alaric caught it by what passed for a throat and slammed it against the alley wall with enough force to crack brick. Then he leaned in close, and Petra saw his mouth open, saw the fangs extend fully, and watched as he sank them into the creature's writhing form. Light sickly green and pulsing seemed to drain from the revenant into Alaric, flowing down his throat as he drank. The creature thrashed and weakened, its form growing less substantial, until finally it simply dissolved into nothing, leaving only a faint oily residue on the ground. Alaric straightened, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. When he turned back to Petra, his eyes glowed brighter, more intensely crimson, and power radiated from him in waves that pressed against her like physical weight. "What are you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. I would have thought that was obvious by now. He walked toward her with that same predatory grace, and Petra's back hit the wall she hadn't even realized she'd been retreating. Though perhaps human education has declined more than I realized, if you can't recognize a vampire when you're bleeding in front of one. Vampires. Real, actual vampires. Petra's mind struggled to accept it, even as the evidence stood before her, beautiful and terrible and very definitely real. "Are you going to kill me?" "If I wanted you dead, I would have left you for the revenant." Alaric studied her with an expression she couldn't read. "But you've created a problem. You triggered wards in a restricted area, released a guardian creature, and now you know about us. The council will want you brought in for questioning at minimum. At maximum." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. "I didn't mean to," Petra said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I was just cataloging the new acquisitions. There was a painting renaissance, I think, but the style was wrong. When I got closer to examine it, something pulled at me, like a current. And then the vault door was opening, and that thing was—" "The painting was bait," Alaric interrupted, his jaw tightening. "Someone wanted that revenant released, which means someone knew a human would be working in the gallery." His eyes narrowed. "This wasn't an accident. It was an attack. On me? On me through you." He seemed to come to some internal decision, his posture relaxing slightly. "You can't go home. Whoever orchestrated this will know the revenant failed, and they'll send something else, something worse." He held out his hand, imperious and expectant. "You'll come with me to the court. You'll be safe there while I determine who's trying to start a war using human pawns." Petra stared at his outstretched hand. Every instinct screamed that going anywhere with a vampire was a terrible idea, that she should run while she still could. But the memory of how easily Alaric had destroyed the revenant, the casual display of power that suggested he was holding back enormously, told her that running was pointless. If he wanted her to come with him, she would come with him, willing or otherwise, At least if she cooperated, she might survive until she could figure out an escape. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, cool skin, gentle despite the strength she knew lurked there. "Wise decision," Alaric said, and then the world lurched. They were moving, but not in any way Petra understood. The alley blurred, the streetlights became streaks of gold, and then they were somewhere else, entirely standing in front of massive iron gates set into a stone wall that definitely hadn't been visible from the street. Beyond the gates, she could see a mansion, no, a castle, all Gothic spires and ancient stonework that belonged to another century entirely. How did we... Vampire speed. It's disorienting for humans the first time. Alaric pushed the gates open with one hand, and they swung inward silently despite their obvious weight. "Welcome to the Court of Night. Try not to anger anyone. Most of my kind have very little patience for mortals, and I'd rather not have to defend you more than necessary." The grounds were extensive, sprawling gardens of night-blooming flowers that filled the air with heavy perfume. Petra glimpsed other figures moving through the shadows, more vampires, she assumed, all with that same distinctive white hair and pale skin that seemed to glow in the darkness. They turned to watch as Alaric led her up the path toward the castle's entrance, their red eyes tracking her with varying degrees of interest and hunger. "Don't make eye contact," Alaric murmured, "and stay close. You're bleeding, and blood scent affects even the most controlled of us." The castle's interior was breathtaking vaulted ceilings that soared overhead, walls hung with tapestries that looked genuinely medieval, and furniture that ranged from Gothic to modern in a way that somehow worked. Everything was lit by candlelight, and the occasional electric lamp designed to look like flickering flame, casting dancing shadows that made the space feel alive. And everywhere there were vampires. They filled the halls and rooms, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all beautiful, all deadly, all turning to stare as Alaric swept through with a bleeding human in tow. Petra heard whispers following in their wake, words in languages she didn't recognize, and felt the weight of ancient attention pressing down on her from all sides. Alaric didn't slow, navigating the corridors with the ease of long familiarity until he reached a wing that seemed more private, less populated. He opened a heavy wooden door and guided her inside, finally releasing her hand. The room was clearly his masculine and austere, decorated in blacks and deep reds, with a massive four-poster bed that looked comfortable despite its medieval styling. Bookshelves lined one wall, stuffed with volumes in various languages and states of antiquity. A fireplace dominated another wall, currently cold and dark. "Sit," Alaric said, gesturing to the bed. "I need to properly clean and close that wound before the scent drives the younger vampires into a frenzy." Petra sat, too overwhelmed to do anything else. "You keep saying the court. What is this place? Why does it look like a castle but feel like it's in the middle of the city?" "Because it is in the middle of the city. We built it 300 years ago when this was still farmland, and we've maintained wards to keep humans from noticing it as development closed in around us." Alaric was gathering supplies from a cabinet, actual medical supplies, which somehow surprised her. "The Court of Night is the seat of vampire power in North America. I rule here, along with the Council of Elders, and we maintain the treaties that keep peace between our kind and yours." "You rule," Petra repeated slowly. "You're the Vampire King." "Yes," he said it matter-of-factly, without arrogance or false modesty. "Has been for the last 5 centuries. Give or take a decade. Before that, I was a duke in a country that no longer exists under the name it had then. Before that, other things." He returned to the bed with his supplies and antiseptic. "This is going to hurt worse than before. I need to remove the makeshift bandage and clean the wound properly." He wasn't lying. When Alaric carefully unwrapped the torn shirt from around her ribs, Petra had to bite down on her own hand to keep from crying out. The fabric had stuck to the wound where blood had dried, and pulling it free reopened the gash. Fresh blood welled up, and she saw Alaric's nostrils flare, his pupils dilating until his eyes were more black than red. "You're hungry," she whispered. "Starving," he admitted, but his hands remained steady as he poured antiseptic onto a clean cloth. "I haven't fed properly in days. Council business keeps me too occupied, but I'm far too old to lose control over a little blood. This might sting." Sting was an understatement. The antiseptic felt like liquid fire against her torn flesh, and Petra couldn't completely suppress her gasp. Alaric worked quickly but thoroughly, cleaning away the blood and dirt until he could see the full extent of the damage. "You're lucky," he said finally. The Revenant's claws didn't go deep enough to damage anything vital. It'll scar, but you'll heal. He reached for something else in his supplies, a needle and thread. I'm going to stitch this closed. We can't take you to a hospital, and while I could have one of our physicians attend to you, I'd rather not spread word of your presence any further than necessary until I know who's plotting against me. Have you done this before? Petra asked, watching him thread the needle with movements too precise to be anything but practiced. Many times. War tends to create expertise in field medicine, and I've lived through more wars than I care to count. He met her eyes, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. I'll be as gentle as I can, but I can't make it painless. Do you want something to bite down on? She shook her head, not trusting her voice, and Alaric began to stitch. It was agony, pure and simple. Each pass of the needle through her flesh sent shockwaves of pain radiating out from the wound, and Petra found herself counting breaths, focusing on anything other than what was happening to her body. She studied Alaric instead, the intense concentration on his face, the way his hair fell forward to curtain his features, the scars that marked his torso like a history written in violence. Some of them had to be centuries old. What kind of life left marks on immortal flesh? How did you get them? She asked, desperate for distraction. The scars. Alaric didn't look up from his work, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Which one? I have quite a collection. All of them. That one. She gestured weakly at the massive diagonal scar across his chest. It looks like something tried to cut you in half. Something did. A werewolf alpha during the War of Succession. I'd just claimed the throne after killing the previous king, a tyrant who'd been terrorizing both humans and vampires for his own amusement. The werewolf packs didn't trust me not to be more of the same, so they tested me. Their alpha nearly succeeded in removing me permanently. His hands paused briefly before continuing their work. I survived, obviously, and eventually, we came to an understanding. The packs in the court have been allies ever since. And the others? 200 years of combat training with weapons that could actually harm me. A witch's curse that manifested as burning silver chains. A rival vampire who poisoned me with blessed water and tried to stake me while I was weakened that left the cluster of scars near my heart. A bombing during World War II that I was too slow to avoid. Various assassination attempts using everything from enchanted blades to holy artifacts. He tied off the last stitch and finally met her gaze. When you live as long as I have and hold power others want, you accumulate enemies. And scars. I'm sorry, Petra said, and meant it. Alaric's expression shifted into something she couldn't quite read, surprise, perhaps, or confusion. Why? You didn't inflict them. No, but she struggled to articulate the wave of empathy that had crashed over her looking at his scarred body, seeing the physical evidence of centuries of violence. It must have been painful, all of it. And lonely, maybe, having to be strong enough to survive all that while ruling and making decisions for everyone else. For a long moment, Alaric simply stared at her, and Petra felt heat rise to her cheeks. It was a stupid thing to say, probably. He was a vampire king, a predator, probably incapable of loneliness or, I've ruled for 500 years, he said quietly. And in all that time, I don't think a single person has ever apologized for the wounds I've taken. Thank you. Before she could respond, he was moving again, applying antibiotic ointment to the stitches and covering them with clean gauze. He worked in silence now, and Petra found herself missing their conversation, strange as it had been. What happens now? She asked as he secured the bandage with medical tape. Now, you rest. I'll have food brought to you, human food. And tomorrow, once you've regained some strength, we'll figure out who used you as bait and why. He stood, gathering the soiled medical supplies. You'll stay in this room. It's the safest place in the court. No one enters the king's chambers without permission or a death wish. Your chambers, Petra repeated. Where will you sleep? I don't sleep much anymore. I'll have work to do investigating this attack. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Don't leave this room, Petra. I mean it. The court is dangerous for humans even under the best circumstances, and there are vampires here who would see you as prey or a political statement. In here, under my protection, you're safe. Out there. He didn't finish, but his meaning was clear. I understand, she said, and she did. She was a prisoner, albeit a relatively comfortable one. But the alternative was death. either from whoever had sent the revenant or from the dozens of hungry vampires she'd seen in the halls. Alaric nodded once and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Petra heard the sound of a lock engaging, keeping others out, or keeping her in. Probably both. She sat on the massive bed in the Vampire King's chambers, wearing blood-stained clothes and wrapped in bandages, and tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. This morning, she'd been a normal woman with student debt and a weird job. Now, she was entangled in vampire politics, marked as bait in some elaborate power play, and under the protection of an ancient immortal who'd torn his own shirt off to save her life. The memory of Alaric's scars rose unbidden in her mind, so many, layered over centuries. What must it be like to carry that much history written on your own skin? To survive for hundreds of years, always fighting, always ruling, always strong? And why had her sympathy seemed to surprise him so much? Petra laid back carefully, mindful of her injury, and stared at the canopy above the bed. She should be terrified. She was terrified, on some level, but beneath the fear was something else, curiosity, maybe, or fascination. Alaric had saved her when he could have left her to die, had tended her wounds with unexpected gentleness, had promised to protect her while unraveling the conspiracy that had targeted them both. She was going to survive this. She had to. And maybe, in the process, she'd understand why a Vampire King's scars had made her heart ache with empathy for a creature she should have feared above all else. Sleep claimed her eventually, dragged her down into darkness despite her intention to stay alert. She dreamed of white hair and red eyes, of battles fought across centuries, of scars that told stories no one else bothered to hear. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through gaps in the heavy curtains, and someone had draped a blanket over her while she slept. A tray of food sat on the bedside table, fresh fruit, bread, cheese, and water, all arranged with care. Alaric must have brought it, moving silently enough not to wake her. The thought sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Petra ate slowly, her side aching with every movement, and tried to form a plan. She couldn't just sit here waiting for Alaric to solve everything. She'd spent 6 years learning to research, to analyze, to piece together historical puzzles from fragments of evidence. Maybe she could help figure out who was behind the attack. Maybe she could make herself useful instead of just being a victim to be protected. The door opened as she was finishing the last of the bread, and Alaric entered carrying an armful of clothing. He looked different in daylight, still pale, still beautiful, but somehow more real, more solid, He wore a different shirt now, charcoal gray and fitted, and his hair was tied back from his face. "You're awake?" "Good." He set the clothes on the bed jeans, a soft sweater, undergarments still in packaging. "These should fit reasonably well. One of my associates is human-sized and owed me a favor. Your own clothes are ruined." "Thank you." Petra fingered the sweater, surprised by the thoughtfulness. "Have you found anything?" "Possibly. I spent the night reviewing security footage from the museum and cross-referencing it with known enemies." He sat in one of the chairs near the fireplace, gesturing for her to continue eating. 3 nights ago, someone tampered with the wards around the deep vault. The footage shows a vampire I don't recognize, which is concerning. I know every vampire in this territory by sight and scent, which means either someone from outside our borders has infiltrated the court, or one of my own has found a way to disguise themselves. Why would they want to release that revenant thing? Revenants are indiscriminate killers. Once released, they hunt until they're destroyed or until they kill their marked target. In this case, you. Alaric's eyes narrowed. The question is whether you were the intended target from the beginning, or whether you were simply convenient bait to draw me out. I have enemies who would love to see me weakened or distracted. "The woman who hired me," Petra said suddenly, "Lysandra. You said it was her collection. Could she be involved?" "Lysandra has been on the council for 3 centuries and has never shown any interest in challenging my rule. But it's worth investigating." He stood, restless energy radiating from him. "I'm calling a council meeting for tonight. All the elders will be required to attend, and I'll be watching to see who seems nervous or pleased by recent events." "Can I come?" The words were out before Petra could think better of them. "To the meeting, I mean. If someone's using me as a pawn, I want to see them. I might recognize something, or notice something you miss because you're focused on vampire politics." Alaric turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised. You want to walk into a room full of ancient vampires who all know you're bleeding under that bandage, and some of whom may want you dead? Yes, Petra said, lifting her chin. I do. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse outright, tell her she was being stupid and reckless. Instead, a slow smile crossed his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire appearance from coldly beautiful to devastating. You're brave, he said. Foolish, but brave. I like that. The smile faded into something more serious. If you come, you stay by my side at all times. You don't speak unless I give you permission. And if I tell you to leave, you run and don't look back. Agreed? Agreed. Then get dressed. We have a few hours before sunset and the meeting, and I want to teach you some basic defensive techniques in case you're attacked again. He moved toward the door, then paused. And Petra, thank you. For what? For wanting to help instead of just hiding and hoping I'll protect you. Most humans in your position would have given up by now. He met her eyes, and something passed between them, understanding, maybe, or the first fragile thread of trust. It's refreshing. He left before she could respond, and Petra was alone with her racing heart and the growing realization that she might be developing feelings for a vampire king who was entirely out of her league in every possible way. She dressed quickly, pleased to find that the clothes did indeed fit well. The sweater was soft cashmere, expensive and warm, and the jeans were her exact size. Alaric had clearly paid attention when sizing her up, which should probably have felt invasive, but somehow didn't. It felt like being cared for, which was dangerous territory for her heart. When she emerged from the room, she found Alaric waiting in the corridor. He led her deeper into the castle, away from the populated areas, until they reached what looked like a training room padded floors, weapon racks on the walls, and space to move. It smelled of old sweat and newer blood, a combination that made her stomach turn. The first rule of surviving an attack, Alaric said, moving to the center of the room, is understanding that you probably can't win. Vampires are faster, stronger, and more experienced than any human. Your goal isn't to beat your opponent, it's to survive long enough for help to arrive or to escape. He spent the next 2 hours teaching her how to break holds, where to strike to cause maximum pain, even if you couldn't cause real damage, how to use an attacker's momentum against them. He was patient, but demanding, correcting her form again and again until her muscles burned and her injured side screamed protest. Again, he said when she stumbled during a dodge, you're telegraphing your movement. Keep your weight centered. I'm trying, Petra gasped, sweating despite the cool air. It's hard to move fast when I have a hole in my side. If you're being attacked, you won't have the luxury of waiting until you've healed. Again. They went again, and this time she managed the dodge cleanly, slipping under his arm and pivoting away. Alaric nodded approval. But better. You're a quick learner. He caught her by the shoulder before she could move past him, his touch gentle despite his strength. But you're exhausted and you're hurting. That's enough for today. I can keep going. You're bleeding through your bandage, Alaric interrupted, and Petra looked down to see that he was right. A spot of red had bloomed through the sweater at her side. I pushed you too hard. Come on, let's get that changed before you pass out. Back in his chambers, he had her sit on the bed while he carefully peeled away the sweater and checked the stitches. One had torn slightly, but the wound itself hadn't reopened fully. Not as bad as it could be, he murmured, cleaning away the fresh blood with steady hands. But you need to be more careful. Mortal bodies are fragile. Says the man covered in scars that prove even immortal bodies aren't invincible, Petra countered, then bit her lip. Sorry, that was rude. It was honest. I prefer honesty. Alaric applied fresh bandages, his fingers cool against her skin. You asked earlier how I got my scars. Would you like to hear the stories? We have time before the meeting. Petra found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to. There was something about the way he'd asked, not offering the information as entertainment, but as though he genuinely wanted to share, wanted her to understand. Alaric sat back, his expression distant with memory. I was turned in 1476 during a minor skirmish in what's now Romania. I was 28, which is relatively old for turning. Most vampires prefer younger blood. But the woman who turned me saw something in me, she said. Potential. I'd been fighting for years by then, first as a common soldier, and then as a commander. I knew violence. I knew strategy. When I woke as a vampire, those skills became amplified. Why did she turn you? Because she needed warriors. There was a war happening between vampire factions, and she was on the losing side. She turned me and a dozen others, shaped us into weapons, and sent us out to kill her enemies." His voice was carefully neutral, but Petra heard the pain underneath. "I was good at it. Too good. Within 20 years, I'd earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous vampires in Europe, and I hated myself for it. What changed? The woman who made me died, killed by a rival. I was free for the first time since my turning, and I didn't know what to do with that freedom, so I wandered, fought, earned more scars, until I met the previous king and he offered me a position in his court." Alaric's jaw tightened. He was cruel, loved power for its own sake, and used it to cause pain, vampire and human alike. I served him for nearly 2 centuries before I couldn't stomach it anymore. I challenged him, killed him in single combat, and took the throne. And you've been king ever since. Yes, 500 years of trying to be better than the monster who came before me, of building treaties and maintaining peace and making hard choices that sometimes keep me awake, even though I don't need sleep." He met her eyes, and the vulnerability in his gaze stole her breath. "I've killed thousands. Petra. Directly or through orders I've given. I carry those deaths along with these scars, and some days I wonder if I'm any better than the tyrant I overthrew." Without thinking, Petra reached out and laid her hand over the massive scar that crossed his chest. His skin was cool under her palm, smooth except where the scar tissue raised it into ridges. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "Twice now. You could have left me to die, could have let the Revenant kill me, or just drained me yourself when I was bleeding. But you didn't. You tore up your own shirt to bandage me, brought me somewhere safe, and you're trying to protect me even though I'm nobody. That doesn't sound like a tyrant to me." Alaric stared at her hand on his chest, something raw and almost painful crossing his face. "You don't know me. Not yet, but I'd like to." The admission felt huge, terrifying, but Petra didn't take it back. "You've spent centuries being strong for everyone else. Who's strong for you?" He caught her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers, and for a moment she thought he might pull away. Instead, he held on, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that felt almost reverent. "You're dangerous," he said softly. "Not because you're strong or powerful, but because you see me as something other than a king or a monster. That's far more terrifying than any weapon." "Is that bad?" "I don't know yet." His grip tightened fractionally. "But I know I should send you away, put you somewhere safe and forget about you once this conspiracy is resolved. You'd be safer away from me, away from the court." "But you won't," Petra said, heart racing. "Will you?" "No." The admission seemed dragged from somewhere deep. "I won't. Selfish as it is, I want you to stay. I want you to keep looking at me like I'm still capable of being something other than violence incarnate." He released her hand and stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "The sun is setting. We need to prepare for the council meeting." Petra let him retreat, understanding that she'd pushed against something vulnerable and he needed space. But the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin, and she found herself hoping that whatever was building between them would have a chance to grow into something real. The council chamber was everything she'd imagined and worse, a vast circular room with a domed ceiling, lit by hundreds of candles that cast flickering shadows across walls hung with ancient tapestries. A massive round table dominated the center, carved from a single piece of dark wood and polished to a mirror shine. Around it sat 12 vampires, each one radiating power and age in waves that made the air feel thick. All of them turned to stare as Alaric entered with Petra at his side. "You bring a human to council?" One of them, a woman with white hair braided into an elaborate crown, her red eyes sharp with disdain, stood abruptly. "This is unprecedented. The unprecedented times call for unprecedented measures, Lysandra." Alaric's voice was cold authority, nothing of the vulnerable man she'd glimpsed in his chambers. This was the king, and his power filled the room like a physical presence. "Someone used this human to attack me, someone in this room, or someone working for someone in this room, so she stays until we determine who." Lysandra's expression flickered with something anger, fear, before smoothing into neutrality. "You accuse the council? I state facts. 3 nights ago, someone tampered with the wards protecting your collection, Lysandra. Someone placed bait a painting designed to draw the attention of a curious human and released a revenant keyed to kill her. When I investigated and destroyed the revenant, I prevented an attack clearly meant to either kill me or test my defenses." Alaric moved to his seat at the head of the table, pulling out the chair next to him for Petra. So yes, I'm accusing someone on this council or in their employ. And I will have answers. The vampires exchanged glances, a complex, silent communication that Petra couldn't begin to interpret. She sat carefully, hyper-aware of her mortality in a room full of immortal predators. Several of them were staring at her with undisguised hunger, their nostrils flaring as they scented her blood. The human is injured, another vampire said, male, lean and angular, with an accent that sounded vaguely French. Her blood scent is distracting. Perhaps she should wait elsewhere. Nikolai makes a good point, someone else added. We can hardly focus on important matters with a bleeding mortal present. Then I suggest you practice your control, Alaric said, his tone sharp enough to cut, because she stays. A tense silence fell across the chamber. Petra could feel the weight of attention pressing down on her, could sense the undercurrents of power and politics flowing around the table. These were creatures who'd lived for centuries, who'd survived through cunning and strength, and she was a fragile human, sitting among them like prey in a den of predators. Very well, Lysandra sat again, folding her hands on the table before her. Ask your questions, my king. We are, as always, at your disposal. The interrogation that followed was brutal and precise. Alaric questioned each council member about their whereabouts, their access to the museum's wards, their knowledge of the restricted vault. He probed for inconsistencies, watched for tells, and slowly built a picture of who had opportunity and means. Petra watched too, noting the small things, how Lysandra's fingers tightened imperceptibly when asked about the painting, how Nikolai's eyes kept sliding away from direct contact, how an older vampire named Casimir seemed entirely too relaxed given the accusations flying. 2 hours in, Alaric stood abruptly. Enough dancing around this. Lysandra, you've been managing the museum collection for 2 centuries. You're the only one with unrestricted access to the vault wards, and you recommended that we hire a human conservator despite the council's concerns about security. You want to explain why? I thought it would be useful, Lysandra said coolly. Human expertise in art restoration exceeds our own. In some areas, we're too close to the work, too much a part of the history. I wanted fresh eyes. Or you wanted a convenient target. Alaric's voice dropped to something dangerous. I've known you for 300 years, Lysandra. You've been loyal and valuable. Which is why I'm giving you one chance to tell me the truth. Did you orchestrate this attack? For a long moment, Lysandra met his gaze without flinching. Then something in her expression cracked, and she looked away. Not alone, she whispered, but yes. The chamber exploded into chaos. Vampires shouting, some rising from their seats, others demanding explanations. Through it all, Alaric remained still, his face carved from stone. Explain, he commanded, and the room fell silent. Now. Lysandra's composure was crumbling visibly, centuries of control giving way to something raw. You've ruled for 500 years, Alaric. 500 years of peace and treaties and careful management, and in that time, we've grown weak, complacent. We bow to human laws, hide in shadows, pretend we're not the apex predators we were born to be. I wanted to remind you of what you used to be, a warrior, a conqueror, not this diplomat you've become. So you tried to have me killed? I tried to force you to fight. Lysandra stood, her hands slamming down on the table. I thought if you faced a real threat, if you remembered what it was like to protect something, someone you'd remember why you took the throne in the first place. To lead with strength, not this endless negotiation. And the human? Alaric gestured to Petra. She was just collateral damage in your little scheme to manipulate me. She was bait. Yes. I thought if a mortal was endangered, you'd respond as you used to with overwhelming force. I didn't expect you to. Lysandra's gaze flickered to Petra, and something like regret crossed her face. To care about her survival beyond political necessity. The admission hung in the air, and Petra felt every eye in the room turn to her. She forced herself to meet their stares, refused to show the fear that was coiling in her gut. Lysandra had used her, nearly gotten her killed, all to prove some point about vampire politics and Alaric's leadership style. You nearly killed her, Alaric said, his voice deadly quiet. Released a revenant keyed to her death. If I'd been even minutes slower, if I'd been distracted or delayed, she would have been torn apart. And you did this because you disapprove of how I rule. I did it because I love this court, Lysandra shot back, because I've watched you become softer with each passing decade, more concerned with human approval than vampire strength. We're predators, Alaric, immortals. We shouldn't be asking permission to exist from creatures who live for barely a century. We're also not monsters who kill for sport or terrorize the innocent for our own amusement. That's what I overthrew. That's what I've spent 5 centuries ensuring we never become again. Alaric's power flooded the room, pressing down on everyone present with suffocating force. You wanted me to remember what I used to be? Fine, I'll remind you. He moved faster than Petra could follow, crossing the space between himself and Lysandra in a blink. His hand closed around her throat, lifting her off the ground as easily as picking up a doll. I used to kill anyone who betrayed me, he said softly. I used to make examples of those who questioned my authority. I used to rule through fear and violence. And yes, we were strong. We were also hated by humans and by our own kind. Is that what you want me to be? Lysandra clawed at his hand, gasping. The other council members sat frozen, none daring to intervene. Alaric, Petra's voice was small in the vast chamber, but somehow it cut through the tension. Don't. He didn't look at her, didn't release Lysandra. She tried to have you killed. I know, and she should face consequences. But killing her now, like this, proves her point, doesn't it? That you're still just a warrior who solves problems with violence? Petra stood carefully, her side aching with the movement. You told me you've spent 500 years trying to be better than the tyrant you overthrew. Don't let her anger push you back into being him. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, Alaric's fingers opened, and Lysandra fell to the floor, coughing and gasping for breath. You're right, he said, still not looking at Petra. But mercy has its limits. He addressed the council, his voice ringing with authority. Lysandra is stripped of her position on this council and banished from my territories. She has until dawn to leave. If she remains past sunrise, she'll be hunted and destroyed. Does anyone object? Silence. No one objected. Good. As for the rest of you, let this be a lesson. I rule with diplomacy because I choose to, not because I'm weak. Question my methods if you must, but never mistake restraint for inability. I am still the vampire who killed a king and survived a war. I will always be that vampire. I've simply learned when not to use those skills. His gaze swept the table. This council is dismissed. Leave, all of you. They fled, there was no other word for it. Ancient, powerful vampires who'd lived for centuries practically ran from the room, leaving only Alaric, Petra, and Lysandra collapsed on the floor. Alaric finally turned to Petra, and the expression on his face was complex gratitude, exhaustion, and something that might have been wonder. You stopped me, he said. Why? Because killing her would have hurt you, Petra answered simply, and I didn't want to watch you become something you'd hate yourself for being. I've killed before, many times. In war or self-defense, or to protect others. This would have been execution born from anger and betrayal. That's different. She moved closer, ignoring Lysandra's presence. You asked earlier who's strong for you. Maybe I can be. When you need someone to remind you of who you want to be instead of what you've had to become. Alaric reached out and cupped her face with one hand, his touch gentle despite the violence that had filled him moments before. You're extraordinary. You know that? Before Petra could respond, Lysandra spoke from the floor, her voice raspy. She's human, Alaric, mortal. In 60 years, maybe less, she'll be dead and you'll have centuries stretching ahead without her. Is this really what you want, to care for something so temporary? Get out, Alaric said without looking at her. Now, before I change my mind about mercy. Lysandra left, moving with wounded dignity, and then they were alone in the vast council chamber. She's right, Petra said quietly, about me being temporary. I'll age and die while you stay the same. That's not fair to you. Life isn't fair. If it were, I wouldn't have lived for 500 years watching everyone I've ever cared about turn to dust. Alaric's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. But that doesn't mean I should deny myself connection when I find it. You make me want to be better, Petra. You see past the king and the monster to whoever I am underneath all of that. Do you know how rare that is? I'm not that special. You stopped me from killing someone out of rage. You offered me sympathy for scars I've carried for centuries. You're here, in a castle full of vampires who could kill you in seconds. And instead of cowering, You stood up in a council meeting and reminded me of my own principles." He leaned closer, his breath cool against her lips. "You're extraordinary, and temporary or not, I want every moment you'll give me." "I'm scared," Petra admitted. "Of this. Of you, of what I'm feeling. It's too much, too fast." "I know. I'm scared too. I haven't let myself care for anyone in decades because the loss becomes unbearable, but I can't seem to help myself with you." His forehead touched hers, a gesture of intimacy that felt more profound than any kiss. "Tell me to stop. Tell me to send you away for your own safety, and I will. I'll protect you from a distance, ensure you're safe and cared for, and never trouble you again." "What if I don't want that?" The words were a whisper, but they felt like shouting. "What if I want to stay, even knowing how this has to end eventually?" "Then stay." Alaric's lips brushed against hers, soft and questioning. "Stay and let me love you for whatever time we have. Stay and be the person who reminds me I'm more than the sum of my scars and sins. Stay and let me protect you, care for you, worship you the way you deserve." Petra closed the distance between them and kissed him properly, pouring 5 days of fear and confusion and growing affection into the contact. Alaric responded with a hunger that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with connection, his arms wrapping around her carefully, mindful of her injury. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard despite only one of them needing air, Petra smiled. "I'll stay. For as long as you want me." "Forever then," Alaric said. "Or as close to it as we can manage." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt surreal and perfect. Petra moved fully into Alaric's chambers, her injury healing slowly under his careful attention. He taught her about vampire culture and history, showed her the court's library and art collections, introduced her to the vampires who could be trusted not to see her as prey. In return, she taught him how to laugh again, how to relax, how to be something other than a king for a few hours at a time. They spent nights talking about his past and her present, about art and history and philosophy. He told her stories of centuries gone by, of wars fought and loves lost, of mistakes made and lessons learned. She told him about growing up human and ordinary, about her passion for art restoration, about the small dreams she'd had before vampires became her reality. And slowly, carefully, they fell deeper in love. Petra learned the geography of his scars, tracing each one with gentle fingers while he told her its story. The burn marks from fighting beside soldiers in World War II, the puncture wounds from an assassination attempt in Victorian London, the claw marks from a dozen different battles with creatures she'd thought were myths. Each scar was a piece of history, a moment where he'd survived something that should have killed him. "You're so strong," she murmured one night, her hand spread over the massive diagonal scar across his chest. "I can't imagine living through all of this." "Strength isn't the same as bravery," Alaric said, his fingers combing through her hair. "I survived because I'm hard to kill, not because I was particularly brave. You're braver than I've ever been, you're mortal and fragile, and you chose to stay here anyway, knowing the dangers. I stayed for you. I know. That's what makes it brave." He tilted her face up to his and kissed her slowly, thoroughly. "I love you, Petra Carver. However long we have, I want you to know that. You've given me something I thought I'd lost centuries ago." "What's that?" "Hope. The belief that I can be more than what I was made to be, that I deserve gentleness and care along with the burden of ruling." His arms tightened around her. "You saved me in the alley that first night, not just from the Revenant, but from 500 years of forgetting how to be anything but strong." "You saved me too," Petra said, "and I love you, even though you're terrifying and immortal and could probably snap me in half without trying. I would never. I know. That's why I love you." She kissed him again, then settled against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. "Tell me another story. About somewhere you've been, something you've seen." Alaric told her about Venice in the Renaissance, about the court of Versailles, about witnessing the fall of the Berlin Wall. His voice was a rumble in his chest beneath her ear, soothing and constant, and Petra felt safer than she'd ever been in her life. 3 months after the night in the alley, Alaric called another council meeting. This one was smaller, just the remaining elders who'd proven trustworthy, plus a few advisors and warriors. Petra attended at his side, no longer nervous about being in a room full of vampires. They'd grown accustomed to her presence, accepted her as the king's consort even if the title had never been formally bestowed. "We have a problem," Alaric announced without preamble. "Reports from the Western territories indicate organized resistance to the treaties. Groups of younger vampires arguing that we should abandon diplomacy and return to the old ways, hunting humans openly, ruling through fear." "Lysandra's influence," Nikolai said grimly. "She's been spreading her rhetoric since her banishment, finding ears willing to listen. Then we stop her. Permanently." This from Casimir, the ancient vampire who'd seemed too relaxed during the first council meeting. "She's proven herself a traitor. Why let her continue sowing discord?" "Because killing her would prove her point that I rule through violence rather than law," Alaric said. "No, we handle this differently. We show the younger vampires what our treaties have gained us: peace, stability, the freedom to exist without constant warfare. We remind them that strength isn't measured in body count but in the ability to build something lasting." "A demonstration, then," someone suggested. "Show them what we've built here." "More than that, an alliance." Alaric looked around the table. "The werewolf packs, the witch covens, the fey courts, all of them have prospered under the current treaties. What if we formalized those alliances, created a coalition of supernatural powers united not by force, but by mutual benefit?" The discussion that followed was intense, vampires debating the merits and risks of such a bold political move. Petra listened, occasionally offering observations that came from her human perspective, and was gratified when several elders actually considered her input seriously. By the end of the night, they had a summit, bringing together representatives from all the major supernatural factions to discuss formalizing their existing treaties into something more permanent. It would be dangerous, putting so many powerful beings in one place, but if it succeeded, it would reshape the political landscape for centuries to come. "You'll be at my side," Alaric told Petra as they returned to their chambers, "as my partner and advisor. Some of the other factions have human liaisons. It will help show that cooperation between species is possible." "I'm not exactly qualified to advise on supernatural politics," Petra pointed out. "You're qualified to remind me to be better than my worst impulses. That's more valuable than any amount of political experience." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Besides, I want you there. Want everyone to see what you mean to me. That love between human and vampire isn't just possible, but beautiful." The summit was held 6 weeks later, in a neutral location, a sprawling estate in the mountains that belonged to no single faction. Petra stood beside Alaric as representatives arrived, werewolf alphas who moved with predatory grace, witches whose power crackled in the air around them, fey nobles who looked both gorgeous and unsettling, and vampires from territories across the continent. The negotiations were tense, complex, and exhausting. Petra found herself acting as translator sometimes, helping to bridge the gap between immortal perspectives and mortal concerns. She suggested compromises, pointed out common ground, and slowly helped forge connections between groups that had viewed each other with suspicion for centuries. And through it all, Alaric was magnificent. He led with confidence, but listened to dissenting voices. He was firm when necessary, but willing to compromise when possible. He embodied everything Petra had seen in him from that first night: strength tempered with compassion, power balanced with wisdom. On the final night of the summit, with treaties signed and alliances formalized, Alaric stood before the assembled delegates and made an announcement that shocked everyone present. "I have one more piece of business," he said, his hand finding Petra's and holding tight. "For 5 centuries, I've ruled alone. I've believed that a king should be solitary, should sacrifice personal connection for the good of those he governs. I was wrong." He turned to face Petra fully, and his expression was open in a way she'd never seen in public, vulnerable and hopeful and deeply in love. "Petra Carver, you walked into my life by accident and changed everything. You reminded me how to be gentle. You showed me that strength and compassion aren't opposites, but complements. You loved me despite perhaps because of all my scars and history and mistakes." He sank to one knee, and Petra's heart stopped. "I can't give you immortality. I can't promise you'll never age or face danger, but I can promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you for every single day you'll have me. Marry me. Be my queen, my partner, my reminder of why peace is worth fighting for." The room had gone utterly silent. Petra was aware of dozens of eyes on them, of the political implications of a vampire king marrying a human, of the precedent this would set. But mostly she was aware of Alaric's hand in hers, of his red eyes bright with hope, of the way her heart was racing so fast it might burst. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying in the silence. "Yes, absolutely yes." The chamber erupted, some in applause, some in shocked whispers, some in what sounded like genuine joy. Alaric stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly while their audience either cheered or muttered their concerns. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, "Thank you, for saying yes, for staying, for loving someone as damaged and complicated as me." "Your scars don't make you damaged," Petra whispered back. "They make you who you are. Every one of them is proof that you survived, that you fought for something, that you lived. I love all of them because I love you." The wedding was held 3 months later, a blend of vampire tradition and human custom that created something entirely new. Petra wore white lace that would have made any mortal bride jealous, while Alaric was resplendent in formal clothing that managed to be both modern and timeless. They exchanged vows in front of representatives from every major supernatural faction, binding themselves not just legally, but magically, a witch's blessing that would tie Petra's life force to Alaric's, slowing her aging and extending her lifespan far beyond normal human bounds. "It won't make you immortal," the witch explained beforehand, "but it will give you centuries instead of decades, time enough to truly build a life together." Petra had accepted without hesitation. The thought of growing old while Alaric stayed young had haunted her, but this was a gift beyond measure. Centuries with the man she loved, time to truly explore what they could build together. Their wedding night was spent not in passion, but in quiet conversation, lying tangled together in their chambers while candles burned low. "Tell me what you're thinking," Alaric murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I'm thinking about that first night, when you tore your shirt to bandage me. I was so scared, but you were so gentle despite everything. Even then, I think some part of me knew you were special." Petra shifted to look at him properly. "And I'm thinking about your scars and how I used to look at them and feel sad for all you'd endured. But now I look at them and feel grateful. Grateful that you survived everything that made them. Because if you hadn't, if any of those battles or assassination attempts had succeeded, we never would have met. I wouldn't have found you, and that would be the real tragedy." She pressed her palm over the diagonal scar across his chest, feeling his cool skin beneath her hand. "Every scar is a road that led you to me. How could I not be grateful for that?" Alaric caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I spent 500 years thinking these scars were ugly reminders of my failures, times I wasn't fast enough, strong enough, smart enough to avoid damage. But you've made me see them differently, as proof of survival, as history written on my body, as something other than shame." "They're beautiful," Petra said firmly. "Just like you, all of you, scars and history and the weight of centuries you carry." "I love you," Alaric said, and the words held the weight of everything he couldn't quite articulate: gratitude, wonder, devotion, and the fierce protectiveness that had defined him from the moment he'd found her bleeding in that alley. "I love you too, my vampire king, my scarred warrior, my husband." They made love slowly, carefully, taking time to memorize each other anew with the knowledge that they had centuries ahead to continue learning. Alaric was gentle despite his strength, reverent despite his hunger, and when they finally lay sated and exhausted in each other's arms, Petra felt more at home than she ever had in her mortal life. The years that followed were full and rich. Petra became queen in truth, her human perspective proving invaluable in negotiations between supernatural factions and mortal governments. She helped establish programs for humans with supernatural talents, created art exchanges between vampire collections and human museums, and slowly, carefully built bridges that made the world safer for everyone. And Alaric softened in ways that surprised even the oldest vampires who'd known him for centuries. He laughed more freely, delegated responsibilities instead of shouldering everything alone, and proved that strength and gentleness could coexist in a ruler. Together, they reshaped what it meant to be vampire royalty, demonstrating that power could be wielded with compassion and that love between human and vampire wasn't weakness, but the strongest foundation possible. On their 10th anniversary, Petra stood in the same alley where they'd first met, Alaric's hand in hers. "I never thought I'd be grateful to get attacked by a shadow monster," she said, smiling at the memory. "But if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have this life. Wouldn't have you." "I never thought I'd be grateful for a conspiracy against me," Alaric replied, pulling her close. "But Lysandra's scheme gave me the greatest gift I've ever received you, bleeding in an alley, too brave to stay down even when you should have been terrified." "I was terrified." "And you stayed anyway. You've been doing that ever since, staying when you could run, choosing love when fear would be easier, being strong when you have every right to be fragile." He kissed her softly. "You saved me, Petra. In that alley, yes, but every day since then, too. You saved me from becoming what I feared most, a king, so focused on strength that I forgot how to be anything else." "We saved each other," Petra corrected. "You gave me a life bigger than I ever dreamed possible, a purpose beyond surviving, a love deeper than I knew existed." They stood together in the alley as night deepened around them, two people from different worlds who'd found each other against all odds, a vampire king with scars that told stories of survival across centuries, a human woman with a wound that had healed into a thin white line on her ribs, both of them marked by violence, both of them choosing love. "Come on," Alaric said eventually, tugging her toward the street. "Let's go home. We have centuries ahead of us, and I intend to spend every moment showing you exactly how much you mean to me." Petra let herself be led, her heart full to bursting with joy. Behind them, the alley faded into darkness, just another forgotten corner of the city. But for them, it would always be sacred, the place where everything changed, where a vampire king tore his shirt to save a dying woman and discovered that even after 500 years, he still had the capacity for love. They walked through the city streets together, hand in hand, and if anyone noticed the pale-skinned, white-haired man and his dark-haired wife, they thought nothing of it. Just another couple in love, enjoying the night. They had no idea they were watching history, the vampire king and his queen, proof that even creatures of darkness could find light, that even the deepest scars could be healed by love, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the moments that should have destroyed you. Petra squeezed Alaric's hand, and he squeezed back, and together they disappeared into the night, ready to face whatever centuries lay ahead. Together, as they always would be. The castle loomed before them as they approached, its Gothic spires reaching toward the stars. Home, Petra thought. Not the small apartment where she'd lived before, worried about bills and student debt. Not the museum with its endless artifacts and lonely nights. But here, in this impossible place with this impossible man, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, and love that defied every rule. They passed through the iron gates, through gardens fragrant with night-blooming flowers, through halls where other vampires nodded respectful greetings to their king and queen. Back to their chambers, where candles still burned and books lay scattered across tables, and centuries of history lived in every stone. Alaric pulled her close once they were alone, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Happy?" "Deliriously," Petra said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Are you?" "More than I have any right to be, more than I ever thought possible." He rested his chin on top of her head, and they swayed slightly, dancing to music only they could hear. "Thank you for choosing this life, for choosing me." "Always," Petra promised, "for as long as I live, which is a very long time now, thanks to that spell." "Not long enough," Alaric murmured. "I'd give you immortality if I could, keep you by my side forever." "We have centuries. That's enough. That's more than most people ever get." She pulled back to look at him properly, studying the face she'd come to know better than her own. "Besides, maybe it's good that I'm not immortal. It means we'll treasure what we have, instead of taking it for granted." "I would never take you for granted." "I know, but the reminder doesn't hurt." She traced the line of his jaw, familiar and beloved. "Now come to bed. Your queen demands cuddles and possibly some thoroughly improper activities." Alaric laughed, genuinely laughed, the sound free and joyful. "As my queen commands." They tumbled into bed together, a tangle of limbs and laughter and love. And if the castle's walls could talk, they would tell stories of a vampire king who learned to be gentle and a human woman who taught him how. They would speak of scars healed not by time, but by acceptance, of wounds bandaged with torn shirts and tended with care, of two impossible people who found each other in darkness and chose to create light. But the walls kept their secrets, and Alaric and Petra kept each other, and that was more than enough. Years turned to decades, and decades began the slow march toward centuries. Petra watched the world change from her position at Alaric's side, saw technology advance and society evolve, saw the treaties they'd helped forge, strengthen, and spread. She never stopped working in art restoration, now with access to pieces most humans would never see, preserving history while making her own. And Alaric continued to rule with wisdom, born from both ancient experience and Petra's modern perspective, becoming a king whose name would be remembered not for conquest, but for the peace he maintained. He was still dangerous when he needed to be, still capable of the violence that had earned him his throne. But he led with compassion first, force as a last resort, and his people prospered under his care. They had children, eventually adopted human children who showed supernatural potential, given a home in the castle, and raised with love. Petra taught them art and history and compassion. Alaric taught them strategy and control and honor. Together, they created a family from children who might otherwise have been lost, and the castle halls that had once echoed with only vampire footsteps now rang with laughter and life. On their 50th anniversary, the entire court gathered to celebrate vampires and humans, werewolves and witches, fae and creatures whose names Petra still couldn't pronounce. They toasted the king and queen who had changed everything, who had proven that love could bridge any divide. 50 years, Petra marveled later, alone with Alaric in their private gardens. And I still feel like that scared woman in an alley, watching you destroy a monster to save me. And I still feel like the cynical vampire who thought he'd forgotten how to care about anyone, Alaric replied. And then I saw you, bleeding and brave and absolutely refusing to give up, and everything I thought I knew about myself turned out to be wrong. Do you think she ever regrets it? Lysandra, I mean, setting everything in motion. I hope so. I hope she sees what we've built and realizes how thoroughly her plan backfired. Alaric smiled, sharp and satisfied. She wanted to remind me I was a warrior. Instead, she gave me a queen and a reason to be something better than I'd ever been. We should thank her, really. Absolutely not. She tried to have you killed. I'm petty enough to hold that grudge for several more centuries. But there was no real heat in his words, just fond exasperation. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the castle, their children were likely still awake, probably causing mischief. Somewhere in the territories, vampires lived peacefully alongside other supernatural beings, protected by laws instead of feared as monsters. And here, in this garden, a vampire king and his human queen held each other close and marveled at the impossibility of their happiness. I love you, Petra said, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last. My scarred warrior, my gentle king, my Alaric. I love you, Alaric answered, as he had countless times before and would countless times again. My brave Petra, my unexpected salvation, my everything. They kissed under the stars, two souls bound by magic and choice, and the night embraced them like an old friend. The years continued their march, but for once, neither of them feared time's passage. They had centuries ahead, countless moments to collect and treasure, endless opportunities to continue building the life they'd created from blood and violence and unexpected love. And if anyone asked how it all began, how a vampire king and a human conservator found each other against all odds, they would tell the truth. With a wound that needed bandaging, scars that told stories of survival, and two people brave enough to see past monster and prey to the souls underneath. That was enough. That would always be enough. Together they walked back toward the castle, ready to face whatever the future held. Behind them, the garden bloomed in darkness, flowers opening to drink in the night. Ahead of them, home waited, full of light and life and love. Petra leaned into Alaric's side, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they crossed the threshold into their future, with hearts full of gratitude for the twisted path that had brought them here. A vampire king with scars worse than hers, a human woman who saw beauty in those scars, and love, fierce and true and strong enough to last centuries. That was their story, written in blood and healed with care, and it was far from over. The end was really just another beginning, and they faced it together as they always would. Forever, or as close to it as two people could manage. And that was more than either of them had ever dared to dream possible.